One of the first stories that we want to talk about is in regards to immigration. So earlier this year, one of the laws that President Trump passed is being dubbed the Migrant Protection Protocol, MPPP. It's also nicknamed as the Remain in Mexico policy. And essentially, what it does is it changes a prior protocol in which we would allow people who were applying for asylum in our country from staying in our country while waiting to be processed for their asylum. So instead, as is evident in the nickname, the Remain in Mexico policy, instead of allowing them to stay in our country, what we do is we send them back to Mexico, if that is where they came from, to await their asylum claims being processed. Now, it's been a little controversial, but I actually think that it is a good policy. Number one, because people use our asylum laws and protocols all the time to get to apply for asylum and then not wait to be processed and then stay in the country because they are allowed to stay in the country while waiting to be processed. And applying for asylum does take a long time, which is part of the problem. There are 800,000 backed up asylum cases that have yet to be processed, and of the asylum cases that are processed, about 50 to 60% of them end up getting denied. In other words, they are not accepted as legitimate refugees or asylum seekers. And this is important because I feel like we should go over what actually qualifies someone to be a legitimate asylum seeker, because I think that there's a lot of confusion around this.
And correct. So we have the definition, the legal definition of a refugee seeker, and if you'd like to go into that.
Yeah. So a refugee is, and this is according to international law, a person with well-founded fear of persecution for reasons of race, religion, nationality, political opinion, or membership in a particular social group. And someone who has been forced to flee his or her country because of persecution, war, or violence that has been a result of any of those factors. So essentially what this means is that if you are leaving a country that is war-torn or is economically downtrodden, you don't simply get to claim asylum because the country that you're leaving is in turmoil. You actually have to be persecuted. You have to yourself be persecuted because of your race, your religion, your nationality, of some characteristic that is out of your control. Now, political opinion is a little bit different, but political opinions are protected, at least in our country, and so we try to enforce those internationally as well by allowing people who are fleeing their countries from persecution of their political opinions to come here. But essentially, this is really important because it means that simply coming into the country because you're looking for better opportunities in the country does not allow you to be a refugee. And a lot of people who are claiming refugee status or seeking asylum are in fact economic migrants, meaning that they don't qualify for refugee status, which is really important. Now, whether or not you agree that that should be what qualifies someone to be refugee status is another question. I think it's something we should talk about, because when we talk about illegal immigration, and this is actually important because a lot of people who try to cross the border illegally then apply for asylum. They apply for asylum after having crossed the border illegally. This is where we start to get into the difference between affirmative asylum claims and defensive asylum claims.
Right.
Because there's a difference. When you make an affirmative asylum claim, you come to a port of entry, and then you claim asylum as soon as you try to enter the country. Whereas when you make a defensive asylum claim, usually that is because you have been arrested or detained for some crime, whether or not it is the crime of crossing the border illegally, which is a crime. So you can be detained for that. You could also be detained for something else, like petty theft or anything really, and then you can try and make a defensive asylum claim so that you aren't deported, because people who are in the country illegally who commit crimes are usually deported because of that.
Right.
So they try to make defensive asylum claims so that they can stay in the country.
I would like to point out, so this is, correct me if I'm wrong, this is part of an ongoing issue that we've been seeing long before the Trump presidency. Immigration has been an ongoing issue.
Absolutely. In fact, there's some interesting immigration numbers. So There are migrant crises all over the world. There's a migrant crisis in Europe, and we're dealing with one as well. And the numbers have been increasing, right? So I've looked at some of the data from the CBP, and virtually every single month of this year, we have seen double the amount of illegal border crossings into our country than we did last year. So roughly most months last year, about 50,000 people would cross our borders illegally, and these are the people who are caught. These aren't even all of the people who make it.
Which is still a huge number, I'd like to point out. Like 50,000 people a month is pretty enormous.
Yeah. This year, however, it's been roughly 100,000 a month. So we have pretty much doubled the number of people coming into our country illegally. And I know that I do want to point out that this is important because I feel like a lot of people nowadays don't understand why it is important to enforce our borders, and there are a variety of reasons, most of which fall under one of two umbrellas, and that is either economics or national security.
Yeah, I mean, it is pretty surprising. Even to this day, we have presidential candidates and politicians alike making the claim that that under their authority, anyone would be allowed to come into the country. People who are big name individuals, people who are running for president, who disregard the idea of border security or some type of regulation on the number of people immigrating to your country. So this is a serious issue, and I mean, if you'd like, we can even break down the fact that this is an issue and why it's an issue. Yeah,
we can, and I think let's talk about the national security issue first. So enforcing your borders is really important. Number one, especially for the United States, because there are terrorists who try to sneak into our country all the time. And while most terrorist organizations do not have access to nuclear weapons, they can get access to dirty bombs. And it is fairly easy to do so. And dirty bombs are very powerful. Now, they're not nuclear weapons per se. They're more like traditional bombs, but they leave behind a lot of radiation that affects the area outside of their blast zone. And that's also very dangerous.
So for anyone who's unfamiliar with dirty bombs, they are laced with cobalt and will create an environment that is radioactive for hundreds, I believe thousands of years. I'm not an expert, but many of these materials that become radioactive with this type of weaponry will stay that way for a long time, rendering an entire area unlivable for incredibly consistent amount of time.